The changes in these economic circumstances appear to have had significant demographic impacts in the Aegean and the Near East, with new centers drawing a lot of immigrants from other regions. The usual culprit of this comes in the form of the so-called Sea Peoples. Who exactly the Sea Peoples were is one of history's most enduring mysteries. However, surviving records of rebellions and desertions occurring in the Hittite Empire around the same time as palace complexes in Mycenaean Greece were being abandoned and Egypt's Levantine provinces were contracting suggest that they were a multi-ethnic group of likely disparate raider groups, whose only commonality was that some external force had driven them from their homelands. Whoever the Sea Peoples were, the level of destruction their raids brought upon the cities of the Bronze Age world is highly debated. Evidence of their raids does appear in the archaeological record, but the picture is not so clear as to suggest they took the form of massive invasions that led to total societal collapse. Various Linear B texts from Mycenaean Greece speak of continuous use of palaces until a sudden sharp end, which ostensibly supports the narrative of a devastating mass invasion. However, the archaeological record shows no hard evidence for any sort of violent mass migration. All sorts of goods moved around the Bronze Age Mediterranean for all sorts of reasons, and discovering, say, an influx of Cypriot goods in Levantine ports during the era of the collapse does not automatically prove a mass invasion took place from the former region to the latter, as those goods could have arrived there for any number of non-invasion related reasons. Inversely, archaeological evidence shows us that some centers in Greece linked to Sea Peoples continued to be actively inhabited well after the era of the supposed collapse, which detracts from the narrative of massive bodies of people leaving their homelands. So, with all that said, let us shift our emphasis away from invasion and towards climate change. Drought has been seen as a possible cause of the complex systems of interactions that occurred at the end of the Bronze Age. Evidence of episodic periods of drought are indeed prominent in the analyses of ancient pollen. This could have led to waves of limited migration from the affected areas to economically more promising regions, resulting in incremental and segmented migrations that wore down the existing palatial systems over time, rather than destroyed them in a single dramatic mass invasion. To add on to this point, centers of culture and commerce had always been shifting in the Bronze Age. For example, Crete went from a well-organized and structured trade center in the Middle Bronze Age to a fragmented peripheral system in the Late Bronze Age. All of this concludes that the Late Bronze Age seems to have been a period of crises and adaptation rather than a total apocalyptic collapse. We can see examples of these crises and subsequent societal adaptations in Mycenaean Greece, which in the Late Bronze Age appeared to have been experiencing significant change in their connectivity with the rest of the Mediterranean, as various forms of internal political instability in the Near East states, such as the Hittite Empire, disrupted many of their traditional trade relations, necessitating Mycenaean society to change and adapt to an increasingly regionalizing Mediterranean world. One way this was done was by asserting strict control over strategic resources. For example, the production of textiles was very heavily regulated. Returning to scripts in Mycenaean palaces, we can observe that the palatial elite appeared able to control every aspect of the workers' lives in this very strategic industry. This political instability caused trade networks to peripheralize in other regions too, resulting in the realignment of prominent trade centers, which beget the rise of cities like Tyre and Sidon. The changes in these economic circumstances appear to have had significant demographic impacts in the Aegean and the Near East, with new centers drawing a lot of immigrants from other regions. Some of these immigrants may have been driven to piracy for various reasons, which led to the ubiquitous narratives of destructive sea peoples during this era. The economic and demographic transformations we have discussed so far had multiple effects in terms of the societal structures of the Mediterranean. Perhaps one of the best examples of this change lies in the cosmopolitan island of Cyprus. The nature of the island's early society is unclear, and its first inhabitants, called the Etiocypriots, also have unclear origins. In the early Bronze Age, Cyprus was known for its copper exports, which allowed for the development of specific economies, which continued to thrive towards the end of the Bronze Age, despite the island being victim to some raiding. As the Mediterranean became more regionalized and politically unstable, Cyprus's stable position as an intermediary between the Near East and the Mediterranean likely led a lot of artisans and other specialists to migrate there. This gradually led to the appearance of Greek and Phoenician-speaking communities on the island. These communities may originally have included raiders or pirates, but almost certainly also had artisans who sought to benefit from the island's new advantageous position. These new artisans may have had to adapt their art to Cypriot elite audiences, who already had contact with Greek and Near Eastern cultures. These cultural contacts led to an increasing Greek and Phoenician presence on the island, which would define the island's history in subsequent periods. The change in these organizational structures across the Mediterranean is best seen as a simultaneous shift in ideology. The long-term processes involved in the regionalization and individualization of trade often led to local and rural communities rejecting traditional royal authority. The royal and martial culture we see in Mycenaean Greece, for instance, changed as warrior tombs became less relevant. In geometric Greece, the less privileged appeared to lose trust in the old Mycenaean political system, leading to the rise of what would become the Greek idea of the demos. In Egypt, however, the story was rather different, as the kingdom would survive for a few more centuries until the conquest of the foreign Libyan and Persian dynasties. In fact, Pharaoh Ramses III appears to have been important in fending off raids and fighting off Nubians in the south. The Middle Assyrian Empire also managed to take over large parts of the Hittite Empire as well as Babylon, and seems to have little contact with coastal raiders. As for Anatolia, regional kingdoms would persist, and later new central polities would take their place, such as the Kingdom of Lydia. Overall, the changes at the end of the Bronze Age allowed for access to new locations, resources, and populations. The relationships and newfound circumstances that emerged allowed for massive socio-economic changes, defined the regimes and states in which people organized themselves, and created new forms of networks that people used. The world of the early Iron Age Mediterranean was one of colonies rather than large empires, and only in later periods would large empires like the Neo-Assyrians and the Persians rise again. The idea of total collapse, either by climate or by invasions, of the broader Mediterranean system does not stand up to scrutiny. Instead, it's best for us to see the decline as a series of long-term processes and short-term events, including the phenomenon of the Sea Peoples and climate change, but also of the processes like the change in the centers of trade and economic migrations. Economic shifts in the late Bronze Age led to a change in interstate and class relations. These stresses led to the decline of palatial authority in Greece and the collapse of the Hittite Empire. These changes, however, were uneven, with other societies surviving and trade continuing in the broader Mediterranean. The demographics of the Mediterranean changed, and new regional economic systems emerged. The result was a broader period of changes that led to the world of the Iron Age.